You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a moment that comes after insight. It's not the moment where everything clicks. It's not the moment you recognise yourself. It's not even the moment where things start to make sense. It's the quieter moment that follows. The one where you realise, I understand this, but I still don't always live it. You know your patterns now. You've seen how you lead when things feel safe. You've recognised how you shift when pressure enters the room. You know what happens when authority feels unstable, when responsibility accumulates, when influence becomes lonely, when connection starts to cost you more than it gives back. And yet, even with all that awareness, you may still find yourself collapsing into familiar responses. Withdrawing, overfunctioning, holding everything alone, giving more than you actually have. Not because you don't know better, but because knowing doesn't always change what the body does under pressure. This episode is about that space, the space between understanding yourself and being able to stay with yourself when it matters. Because wholeness isn't something you arrive at once you've done enough inner work. Wholeness is something you maintain moment by moment, when power, pressure and expectation are present. And that's what we're exploring today. When women hear the phrase becoming whole, many immediately imagine balance. Everything in proportion, all parts integrated, nothing overexpressed, nothing left out. But that image has quietly caused a lot of harm because it suggests that wholeness is a kind of equilibrium, a stable, finished state where nothing pulls too hard and nothing asks too much. And that's not how real leadership works. It's not how power works. And it's not how the nervous system works. You don't fragment because you're unbalanced. You fragment because something inside you believes only one way of responding is safe right now. Under pressure, the system doesn't look for harmony. It looks for efficiency. It asks, what will keep me safe? What has worked before? What do I trust when things tighten? And it routes power accordingly. That's why one archetype often ends up carrying everything. Not because the others are gone, but because they've been temporarily stood down. Fragmentation isn't a failure of integration. It's a survival strategy. And the mistake many women make is trying to fix fragmentation instead of understanding what it's protecting. So if you've ever thought, I should be past this by now, or why do I still default like this? This episode isn't going to ask you to do it better. It's going to ask you to see what's actually happening and what becomes possible when the system no longer has to choose between power and safety. Because becoming the whole woman is not about having all your archetypes online at once. It's about being able to move between them without losing yourself when the stakes rise. And to understand that, we need to talk about how fragmentation really happens and why it made sense when it did. Fragmentation doesn't begin with collapse, it begins with adaptation. Most women don't wake up one day disconnected from themselves. They respond intelligently to what's required of them. A situation tightens, expectations increase, support thins, consequences grow heavier, and the system asks a simple question: what works here? Not what is ideal, not what's balanced, what's effective. I've watched this happen in real time, in rooms that look calm on the surface. A woman sits at a table she's worked hard to earn a seat at. She's prepared, she knows the terrain, she's contributed well for years. But something in the room has shifted. The tone is sharper, The questions land heavier. There's less margin than there used to be. No one announces this. Nothing overt happens. But her body knows. So she adapts. She speaks more precisely. She offers fewer qualifiers. She moves faster through her points. Not because she wants control, but because clarity suddenly feels like protection. In another moment, it looks different. A woman realises she's carrying more than her share. Decisions keep landing with her. People look to her to resolve things that shouldn't be hers alone. So she accelerates. She steps in earlier. She tightens the frame. Stops waiting for consensus. Not because she distrusts others, but because delay now feels risky. And sometimes it goes the other way. A woman who once spoke easily finds herself pulling back. She says less, shares later, keeps more to herself. Not because she has nothing to offer, but because exposure feels costly. You might also recognise it in a much quieter moment. A woman notices tension in a room before anyone else names it. Nothing has been said outright, but the air has changed. Someone looks uncomfortable. A comment lands awkwardly. There's a subtle risk of things becoming strained. And before she consciously decides anything, she adjusts. She softens her tone. She fills the silence. She reframes what was just said so it lands more gently. Not because she agrees, not because she lacks a view, but because keeping things okay feels important. Later she follows up privately, checks in, makes sure no one is upset. She doesn't experience this as self-sacrifice. It feels like care, like emotional intelligence, like being someone who understands people. But over time she begins to notice something else. She's often the one smoothing things over, absorbing discomfort, holding the emotional weight so others don't have to. And she tells herself it's fine, that it's easier this way, that she doesn't mind, until one day she feels it. A flicker of irritation, a quiet heaviness, a sense of being responsible for everyone else's experience. Not because anyone asked her to, because her system learned that connection stays safe when she carries more than her share. None of these women are broken. They're responding. Each response is a learned solution. Each one created safety. Each one made sense in the moment. The problem isn't that you have these patterns. The problem is when the system begins to believe only one of them will keep you safe now. That's when fragmentation takes hold. Because when pressure is sustained, the body doesn't keep reassessing, it commits. It says, this is the way we survive, and it sticks with it even when the environment has changed. That's why insight alone isn't enough. You can understand every archetype intellectually and still feel yourself default when the stakes rise. Because fragmentation lives in the nervous system, not the narrative. And it shows up most clearly when you're under pressure and being watched. Visibility, consequence, expectation. That combination narrows choice. So one archetype steps forward, not because it's superior, but because it's trusted. And the others step back, not because they're weak, but because they're being protected. This is where many women misinterpret what's happening. They think, I've lost access to parts of myself. I've regressed. I should know better than this. But what's actually happening is simpler. Your system has prioritised efficiency over range. And efficiency under pressure always reduces options. Fragmentation is not the loss of wholeness. It's the temporary suspension of choice. And this is where so many women go wrong. They try to integrate by effort, by insight, by forcing themselves to stay present in all their parts at once. But integration doesn't work under demand. So before we talk about what integration really is, we need to talk about why trying harder usually makes it worse. Once women recognise these patterns, they usually do something very understandable. They try to fix them. They notice when they withdraw and they push themselves to stay present. They catch themselves over-functioning and they tell themselves to let go. They hear their sharpness and they try to soften it. They feel the pull to smooth things over and they attempt to hold back. On the surface, this looks like growth, but very often it doesn't create integration. It creates strain. Because integration for many high-capacity women becomes just another standard to meet, another way to perform competence, another way to prove self-awareness, another way to be good at inner work. They think, I know what's happening now, so I should be able to stop it. And when they can't, something familiar creeps in. Self-criticism, frustration, a sense that they're failing at something they understand. But this is where the misunderstanding sits. Integration doesn't fail because women aren't trying hard enough. It fails because it's being attempted at the wrong level. You can't integrate a survival response through effort, because survival responses don't respond to instruction. They respond to safety. When pressure rises, the nervous system doesn't consult insight, it consults memory. It reaches for what works, what reduces risk, what preserves belonging, control, or coherence. So when a woman says, I'm not going to do that this time, but her body still believes something bad will happen if she doesn't, the body wins every time. This is why so many women feel caught in a loop. They can name the pattern, they can see it forming, they can even feel the moment just before it takes over, and still they find themselves inside it. Not because they lack discipline, not because they're avoiding responsibility, but because their system doesn't yet trust that another response is safe. And here's the part that's rarely acknowledged. Trying to integrate under pressure often strengthens fragmentation because the moment becomes loaded. Now it's not just what's happening here. It's, I need to respond differently. I can't let myself do that again. I should be more integrated than this, which adds a new layer of stress. And under stress, the system narrows further. So the archetype that's already leading tightens its grip. The warrior becomes more directive. The wise woman becomes more distant. The tribe builder gives more. The sovereign pulls further inside, not because integration is impossible, but because the conditions for it aren't present. Integration doesn't happen when you demand range from a system that still feels threatened. It happens when the system senses, I don't have to choose just one way to stay safe anymore. And that sensing can't be forced. It has to be experienced. This is why integration doesn't begin with behaviour. It begins with restoring internal safety. With moments, often small ones, where a different response doesn't lead to collapse. Where tension doesn't destroy connection. Where pausing doesn't result in punishment. Where sharing responsibility doesn't lead to loss of control. Those moments teach the body something new. Not through explanation, but through outcome. They say, this is survivable. This didn't cost me what I feared. I'm still here. And slowly choice returns. Not because the pattern disappears, but because it no longer has exclusive authority. This is the shift we're moving towards. Not balance, not perfection, not constant access to every part of yourself, but the ability to stay present long enough for more than one option to exist. And this is where the sovereign returns, not as control and not as dominance, but as capacity. Because integration doesn't require every archetype to speak at once. It requires something inside you that can choose who leads and when. That's what we turn to next. When people hear the word sovereign, they often imagine control, decisiveness, command. the part of you that knows what she wants and makes it happen. And for many women, the sovereign becomes either something to over-identify with or something to avoid altogether. But that version of the sovereign is already distorted, because the sovereign was never meant to do everything. Her role is not to be the strongest voice, not to override the others, not to carry power alone. The sovereign's true function is quieter, and it's far more essential. She's the part of you that's self-actualised, not because everything's resolved, but because nothing essential is disowned. She holds perspective. She tracks the whole system. She recognises what matters now. She creates the conditions in which other archetypes can act effectively. Integration doesn't happen when every archetype is active at once. It happens when there's something inside you that can say, this is a moment for action. This is a moment for restraint. This is a moment for truth. This is a moment for care. Without urgency, without self-justification, without fear that choosing one response means losing access to the others. This is the sovereign's work. She doesn't compete with the other archetypes. She orients them. Without the sovereign, power fragments, not because the parts are wrong, but because no one's coordinating the response. This is what many women experience as internal conflict. One part wants to act, another wants to wait. Another wants to explain, another wants to keep the peace. And instead of choice, there's tension. The sovereign doesn't resolve this by choosing the best part. She resolves it by sequencing. She understands that power is contextual, that leadership changes shape depending on what the moment requires, that no single mode is meant to dominate all situations. This is where sovereignty is often misunderstood. Many women confuse integrity with consistency. They think, if I'm decisive, I should always be decisive. If I'm relational, I should never disappoint. If I'm strategic, I shouldn't need support. But that's not sovereignty. That's rigidity. True sovereignty allows movement. It allows the warrior to stand down when movement isn't required. It allows the tribe builder to stop smoothing when the truth needs space. It allows the wise woman to speak instead of withdrawing. It allows retreat without disappearance. And this only becomes possible when the sovereign herself feels safe. A threatened sovereign collapses inwards. She becomes the hermit, abdicating authority rather than coordinating it. But when the sovereign is resourced, not inflated, not defendant, just present, something subtle shifts internally. There's less urgency to prove, less pressure to be one thing, less fear that changing posture means losing power. The system relaxes because someone is holding the whole, not by force, not by dominance, by perspective. This is why integration isn't about strengthening every archetype equally. It's about restoring the sovereign's capacity to choose. And that capacity doesn't come from authority over others. It comes from internal legitimacy, from knowing you're allowed to move, allowed to respond differently in different moments, allowed to let power change form without disappearing. That trust in yourself and in the system you're holding is what makes wholeness possible. When integration begins, it doesn't feel big and dramatic. There's no moment where everything clicks into place, and certainly no sense of finally having it all together. No permanent arrival. What most women notice first is something much simpler. They feel less rushed inside. Not slower in action, just less compressed. There's a little more space between stimulus and response. A small pause where there used to be urgency. They still feel pressure. They still notice the pull to step in, to withdraw, to take over, to smooth things over. But the pull doesn't immediately take over. Choice reappears. Not as a thought, but as a sensation. a sense that there's more than one way to respond, and none of them threaten who she is. This is the earliest sign of integration. Not balance, not harmony, range. She can act without overfunctioning. She can hold her ground without hardening. She can stay connected without disappearing. She can step back without withdrawing from herself. Nothing big has changed externally, but internally something is no longer fighting for dominance. The system feels held. This is what self-actualisation feels like in practice. It's not certainty, not confidence, but internal legitimacy, a knowing that she doesn't need to prove her right to exist in the room. And because of that, her responses soften. Not into passivity, but into appropriateness. She no longer has to use strength to feel legitimate. She no longer has to give to feel safe. She no longer has to disappear to avoid conflict. She responds from what fits the moment, not from what once protected her. This is where many women notice an unexpected shift. They stop narrating themselves. They're less preoccupied with how they're being perceived, less concerned with getting it right. They're less invested in maintaining a particular identity. Not because they don't care, but because they're no longer trying to hold themselves together. That work has been handed back to the system. And with that comes a different relationship to effort. Effort becomes cleaner, less defensive, less loaded. Action feels available without urgency. Care flows without depleting. Authority is present without performance. There's also more tolerance for discomfort. She can let a conversation be awkward, let someone be disappointed, let a decision take time, not because she's detached, but because she trusts that discomfort won't undo her. This is a profound shift because for many women, fragmentation began as a way to avoid collapse. Integration ends when collapse no longer feels imminent. And here's the part that often surprises women the most. Integration doesn't make them softer or harder. It makes them truer. Their yes becomes clearer. Their no becomes quieter but more solid. Their present becomes less effortful. People around them feel it, not as intensity or as charisma, but as steadiness. Others may not be able to name what's different, but they respond differently. They step up more. They lean in rather than lean on. They take responsibility for their own reactions. Not because she demanded it, but because she stopped compensating. This is how integration expresses itself in the world. Not through visible change, but through redistribution. Power spreads, responsibility evens out, connection becomes mutual again. And this is important to say clearly. Integration does not mean you never fragment again. Under enough pressure, old patterns will still appear. But now something is different. You recognise them sooner, you recover more quickly, and you return to yourself without shame. Fragmentation becomes a signal, not a sentence. And that's the real mark of wholeness. Not the absence of collapse, but the capacity to come back. Once integration is felt this way, power stops being something you manage internally, and it becomes something you can use, without distortion, without self-betrayal. Once women begin to feel this internal shift, something else often follows. A question. A quiet, orienting one. Why did this take so much work? Why did it feel so hard to stay intact? Why did I have to learn this now? And the answer is not that you missed something, or that you were somehow deficient, or you lacked resilience or insight. It's that you adapted to systems that rewarded fragmentation. Many environments don't ask women to be whole. They ask them to be useful. They reward the woman who takes responsibility quickly, who smooths tension before it's named, who absorbs complexity without complaint, who stays composed when things are unclear, who carries emotional labour quietly. Each of these capacities is valuable, but when they're consistently rewarded in isolation, they train the system and the woman to rely on one form of power at the expense of the others. And because women are often praised for adaptability, they rarely receive the feedback that something's off. They're told they're capable, reliable, good with people, strong under pressure, which is true, but it also means there's little incentive for the system to change, so women adjust instead. They learn which version of themselves is welcomed, which expression of power is tolerated, which responses are rewarded. And over time, that learning becomes embodied, not consciously, not strategically, somatically. The body learns, this is how I stay included. This is how I stay safe. This is how I remain legitimate. So when fragmentation appears, it isn't because something's gone wrong internally. It's because the environment consistently pulled power in one direction. And this matters. Because when women start to integrate, they often feel a strange dissonance. They notice they're less willing to overfunction, less inclined to smooth everything over, less tolerant of systems that quietly rely on their self-erasure. And they worry, am I becoming difficult? Am I losing my edge? Am I still valuable here? But what's actually happening is not loss, it's recalibration. The woman is no longer organised around being useful. She's organised around being actualised. And that changes how she shows up. Not loudly and not rebelliously, but unmistakably. She doesn't rush to fill every gap. She lets responsibility be visible. She allows discomfort to exist without immediately resolving it. And this reveals something important. Some systems will adapt. They rise, they redistribute, they mature, and some won't. They resist, they tighten, they try to pull her back into the role she used to play. This is where many women feel unsettled, not because they're unsure of themselves, but because they're encountering the limits of the system. And this is where self-trust becomes critical, because integration doesn't just change how a woman feels internally, it changes what she will and won't carry. And that can be confronting, especially in environments that benefited from her fragmentation. So if integration feels destabilising at times, that doesn't mean it isn't working. It often means it is. You're no longer organising yourself around what the environment needs from you. You're organising around what allows you to remain intact. And that's not selfish, it's mature. This is why so many women reach this point later than they expected. Not because they were slow, but because it takes time, and often pressure, to realise that survival strategies are no longer serving you. Integration isn't a retreat from leadership. It's a refusal to keep leading at your own expense. And once that refusal is internalised, power starts to look very different. Because when women stop carrying power alone, something else becomes possible. Responsibility can be shared. Influence can circulate. Leadership can become relational again without disappearing. One of the most unexpected outcomes of integration is not how a woman feels inside herself, but how the world begins to respond to her. Not immediately, but unmistakably. When a woman stops over-functioning internally, she also stops compensating externally. She doesn't rush in to stabilise every wobble. She doesn't absorb discomfort before it's visible. She doesn't automatically take responsibility for what hasn't been named. And this does something subtle to the systems around her. It reveals what was previously hidden. When she steps back from carrying the emotional and relational load, that load doesn't disappear. It becomes visible. Decisions that were quietly deferred surface. Tensions that were previously smoothed over have to be addressed. Responsibilities that were absorbed now have to be owned. At first, this can feel uncomfortable for everyone. Others may feel exposed, uncertain, momentarily destabilised, And this is where many women attempt to step back in, to rescue, to smooth, to restore the familiar equilibrium. But integration changes the internal calculation. She no longer interprets discomfort as danger. She recognises it as information. Information about what the system has been relying on. Information about what has been unevenly distributed. Information about what needs to be shared, not silently carried. So she stays present. She doesn't withdraw. She doesn't dominate. She doesn't disappear. She allows the system to feel the weight it's been leaning on her to hold. And something interesting begins to happen. Some people step forward. They take responsibility where they hadn't before. They engage more directly. They become more accountable for their own reactions and contributions. Not because they were incapable, but because there was never space. Others struggle. They may resist the change. They push back, attempt to pull her back into the old role. Not out of malice, but out of habit. Because systems, like people, adapt around what's available. And when what's available changes, the system has to reorganise. This is where integrated power becomes visible, not as control, not as assertion, as steadiness. She doesn't over-explain. She doesn't justify her presence. She doesn't rush to make things okay. She trusts that power doesn't need to be held by one person in order to function. And in that trust, power begins to circulate. Responsibility spreads. Influence becomes mutual. Connection stops being managed and starts being shared. This is the shift many women have been longing for, without knowing how to name it. Leadership without depletion, connection without self-erasure, authority without domination. And it only becomes possible when one woman stops compensating for the whole system. This is not withdrawal, it's redistribution. And redistribution always changes the shape of power. But this shift doesn't mean the work is finished. It introduces a new question. What happens when an integrated woman steps fully into her power? Not just internally, but in how she chooses to lead, influence, and shape what comes next. That's the final movement of this episode. There's a moment that comes after all of this. Not clarity, not certainty, not the sense that everything is now integrated forever, but something quieter, a recognition that becoming the whole woman was never about fixing yourself or completing yourself or finally getting it right. It was about no longer abandoning yourself when pressure enters the room. Wholeness doesn't mean every part of you is always present. It means no part of you is exiled. It means you notice when you've tightened, when you've disappeared, when you've overfunctioned, when you've carried more than your share. And instead of judging that moment, you come back. Again and again. Not as a correction, as a return. This is what self-actualisation actually looks like. It's not transcendence, it's not perfection, but it's internal legitimacy. The knowing that you are allowed to move, allowed to respond differently in different moments, allowed to let power change shape without you losing yourself. You don't stop being a warrior. You don't stop being wise. You don't stop caring deeply about people. You don't stop needing space. You've just stopped asking one part of you to do all the work. And because of that, you stop disappearing. The whole woman is not the woman who never fragments. She's the woman who recognises fragmentation as a signal, not a failure. A signal that something needs attention, something needs support, something needs to be redistributed. And she responds not with force, not with effort, but with awareness. That's what makes her whole, not balance, not harmony, capacity. Capacity to hold tension without collapsing, capacity to stay present without overfunctioning, capacity to let others carry their share, capacity to remain herself even when things are unfinished. This is not an ending, it's a threshold. Because once a woman can hold herself this way, power changes. It stops being something she braces against, something she manages internally, something she has to survive. It becomes something she can use, cleanly, consciously, without distortion. And that's where we'll go next. I'm Ros Cardinal. This is the Archetype Effect. And in the next episode, we'll explore what happens when integrated women step into power. Not as dominance, but as alchemy. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.